All right, guys, you are in for a great episode today with Dr. Brooke Scheller. She is a doctor of clinical nutrition, a certified nutrition specialist, and an expert in nutrition for alcohol use. She's the creator of Functional Sobriety, a method of supporting a sober or sober curious lifestyle through nutrition, supplementation, and wellness practices. Brooke is an absolute game changer. I've known her for years. And as she will share in this episode, I've known her through her party girl years. I've known her through her just getting started years. And it's so amazing to see her and her journey and her speaking about not only her path, but the nutrition and the science behind it. This is going to be a game changer for today. All the information will be in the show notes. So if you are listening along and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to, see what this is all about, definitely check out the show notes after the episode. And be sure in the meantime that you subscribe and leave a review, hopefully 5 stars, on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, and YouTube as well. Sit back and enjoy this episode. It is an eye-opener. And remember, this is a totally judgment-free zone. So don't judge yourself, don't judge other people, and give yourself an opportunity to just listen with open eyes and open ears. Hi.
I love it. What's going on?
Friend, I'm so pumped to do this episode with you.
I know I was thinking about you today earlier and thinking about how long we've known each other and how much has changed.
Right. So I was rolling out of hot yoga and I ran into one of my girlfriends and I said, oh, she's religious about listening to podcasts. And she gives me feedback too. She's like, oh, I liked that episode. I want to know more about that. Can you have that person on? Like, it's just great to get feedback. And I said, oh, I'm recording a new episode today. She said, oh, what's the topic? And I said, we're talking about sobriety. And she's like definitely one of my party fun time girlfriends. Like I think her veins run champagne. And she said, she's like, I'm so interested in hearing about that. And I loved that because I think, and I'm just going to jump in, but for our episode here, but I think there's something about sobriety that's sexy, right? It's not
100%.
so taboo. You don't necessarily, and maybe I'm jumping ahead and you're the expert, so I want to hear from you. But I don't know that sobriety necessarily has to mean that you've, gotten in trouble with the law or that you've woken up face first in a box of pizza or something. Be a choice. So I'm so curious for you, Brooke, because I have known you for a long time. What brought you to this path, not only for yourself, but also in sharing this with others and encouraging others along the journey and being a resource?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Bailey. And I'm so happy to talk about this and with someone that knew me like way back when I was just like a budding little newbie in adult life. But there's such a change in the world right now in how people are viewing alcohol. There's a huge push around this idea of becoming sober curious, which essentially just means, you're exploring what life is like without alcohol. And the Gen Z population is actually very much different from the millennial audience in that they're not as interested in drinking alcohol as some of the older generations are. So I know I can speak for myself. I'm sure I can speak for you and even the Gen X kind of audience there, that we drank a lot of alcohol. And I started drinking young, 13 years old, taking vodka from a friend's parents, and that kind of carried on throughout my life. I drank a lot in high school. I drank a lot in college. I drank a lot after college. I dated a lot of people who drank a lot. And it was just something that was a very big part of my life. I surrounded myself with people who drank. It never really seemed like I was doing anything wrong because everyone around me was kind of partaking in the same behavior. Right. And of course, it's really interesting in the health and wellness space too, because there's a lot of alcohol in the wellness world. And when we are trying to do something about our health, about specific health concerns, if we're trying to improve our nutrition, alcohol is a huge saboteur of all of that. And it's so interesting to kind of take that step back and really look at how alcohol is used in our society. And then, of course, in my experience and what I do now, which I'd love to tell you about, is really marrying my background and expertise in nutrition with how alcohol affects our nutritional status, how we can not only use nutrition to heal and repair our body from long-term alcohol use, but also how we can use it to enable our sober or sober curious journey, in that there's a lot of reasons why we might have alcohol cravings, or it might be harder for us to stop. And we can use nutrition and some other tactics there in order to make it easier for people. So it's such an interesting space. There's so much going on around it. And as you can see, I get really excited to talk about it.
Well, as you should, because I do think that there's so much to talk about. I think that, to your point, sometimes it's part of culture. Sometimes it's part of just the way that we grew up. Sometimes it's part of addiction. Sometimes it's part of nutrition, and we have no idea why we have alcohol cravings. And I'd be curious from your perspective. Sometimes for some people, I know it becomes a habit. I know that from my experience, I grew up in a family with an alcohol family dynamic. And I saw my aunt on my mom's side who navigated alcohol and had, she ended up dying from cirrhosis. And then my father's side, my father, my aunt, my grandfather. So a lot of the messages that I received about alcohol was alcohol is dangerous. But then I see everybody drinking it to celebrate. Right? Those are two incongruent messages growing up. So then in developing a relationship with alcohol myself, there was a lot of conflicting messages. And I think that sometimes, unless you question that, you just do what everyone around you either does, or you follow the path of maybe your parents or your siblings or the people before you.
Yeah. And there's so many interesting things about the biochemistry, the neurochemistry, about how alcohol affects our brain and, the different pathways that it rewires. There's a lot of really interesting evidence around the age at which we begin drinking, and how if we start drinking at a younger age, so as a teenager, for example, how that can set us up to have more alcohol use in our adult life, or a tendency towards alcohol use disorder or overuse of alcohol. I typically avoid using alcoholic or alcoholism because there's such a stigma around that still, of, people either saying I am an alcoholic or I am not an alcoholic. And it doesn't really matter how we want to classify it, right?
Good point.
I try to avoid using those types of classifications because for some people, it seems extreme to consider themselves an alcoholic, and they're not necessarily going to walk into an AA room. But just because they're not ready to do that doesn't mean that they're not experiencing an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. But the earlier that we start drinking, the more we train our body and our pleasure systems, our dopamine, to associate alcohol with fun. Right. So that's why when we get older and when we start thinking about, like, you might be listening and saying, take out alcohol, oh, life would be so boring. And that's because we associate alcohol with fun. When we stop drinking, it takes our bodies, our brains a little bit of time to readjust to associating new patterns of normalcy around fun, right? I know when I stopped drinking, people would ask me, what do you do for fun? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. And I had to kind of re-explore that for myself, right? I had to try new things and put myself out there a little bit more in the way that I hadn't done because I had been spending a lot of time at a bar.
What was that like for you, making that decision? Was there even like a specific catalyst? Did it have to do with like you learning more and more about nutrition and being on your career path and then saying like, actually, this doesn't align for me? Give us the scoop.
Yeah. So it's so interesting when I look back now. So I've been sober at the time of the recording of this podcast, just under 18 months. And I'm very proud of that. It's been something that has completely changed every avenue of my life in every single way. And that's one thing that I speak a lot about when I talk about sobriety or changing your relationship with alcohol, is that alcohol keeps us small, right? It keeps us from doing things that we really want to do, that we're capable of doing, because it's sabotaging our mood, our mental health, our physical energy, our our will to kind of want to do anything besides drinking. So in my case, I was a big drinker for a long time. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate in nutrition, as you know, Bailey. And for a long time, I felt like I was on this path to kind of prove that like you could drink alcohol and be healthy, that there was some way to make this all work out. And that, the research showed that it was okay in small levels. So, it's fine. And I lived in this mentality for a long time of, I'm still young, right? Oh, I'm in my 20s. In my early 20s, it was, oh, I'm 21. This is what everybody's doing, right? In my late 30s, it was the same thing. In my late 20s, in my early 30s. But then you start to see like your circles change a little bit, right? Like people start moving off and starting families or getting married and, not necessarily living their lives around going out and socializing and using alcohol. And I think the pandemic was a pretty pivotal point in time for a lot of people in regards to their drinking habits. I like to make the analogy that if we kind of had maybe a problematic relationship with alcohol that was sitting on the back burner of the stove on a simmer, we were kind of getting by. The pandemic kind of cranked up the heat until the pot boiled over for a lot of us.
Absolutely.
And it started because, we were home. It was all fun and games. We were doing Zoom happy hours and, we thought it was going to last 2 weeks, right? And months and months down the line, the more alcohol we put into our system, the more our body thinks it needs it to survive. So if we continue to put alcohol into our system, we continue to want it, to desire it, to crave it. Right. And, I was always a big drinker, and the pandemic shifted a lot of things for me. It created a lot of isolation. It changed a lot of my normal routines and habits. And towards the end of 2020 and early 2021, it had really started to consume my life. I had always been maybe a 4 or 5 day a week drinker, and I had turned into more of a 6 or 7 day drinker. And in the last kind of month or two of my alcohol use, I was drinking every day, and that time started slipping further and further forward. And I'm very grateful that I recognized that pattern when I did, because I feel like that kind of endpoint didn't last long for me, right? I kind of hit this bottom, if you will, right, where I was like, okay, this is not okay. I was experiencing a lot of anxiety. I was experiencing really low mood. And I just felt like I was totally in this funk. And, it wasn't one particular instance. I never got a DUI. I never got in trouble. I never, had any of these, lost a job or any of these extreme things. But I got to the point where I was so sick of my own shit that I had to stop. Like, it was just, that was it. And it wasn't easy for me to do. I had a lot of support, and, having sober people around is really important in making that change, because a lot of times our circles are people who drink, right? So we need to find people who are supportive of this change, are really, wanting to help us kind of move forward in this new lifestyle, which is part of why I created the programs that I have and the things that I'm offering today, because it has been such a life-changing thing for me. Bailey, you and I could talk about goals that I had for years, and things I had carried over year after year onto the next, list of goals for the next year, within months, like, started happening, and of getting sober. And it was because I was more present in my life. It was because I wasn't spending how many hours a week drinking or drunk or hungover. And, my life has changed so significantly since, and it's become such a passion for me.
Right. And I love that it's you and I having this conversation, because you're speaking from the nutrition perspective, and, I'm speaking from a mental health perspective, and there's this intersection, and the intersection happens, I think, in both the lifestyle and the habits that we choose, alongside of like what's actually happening in your brain. The first time that I used the phrase booze blues to a client, I remember her having no idea what I was talking about. And I said, well, alcohol is a depressant. So the fact that you're feeling depressed today, where you feel like you have no reason to be depressed, but you just kind of feel funky and, not your cycle, yada, yada. I said, that's called booze blues. No way. And then I started like understanding that we don't necessarily understand the connection between what we put in our body in a moment that we're trying to blow off steam or have fun or celebrate, or a lot of times like we're depressed or we're angry and we're trying to self-medicate. Like, what's happening in your body, and I want you to explain this for us, that's not just happening in that moment. Like, there are residual effects whether you have a hangover or not.
Yeah, and that's an important point to mention, because I believe that people think about that short-term hangover as being like, oh, well, that's what happens when we drink, right? And we're not necessarily thinking about the effects over the long term and what that means for our brain, for our body, for, all of our physical side of the piece of it. And that's what I like to talk about, Bailey, is you're right. There's this whole mental health component and addressing traumas and all of these other things. And the other piece of it for me is like, what is this biochemistry thing that's going on, right? Because we can only last so long on willpower. Willpower alone can't always keep us sober, right? So it's looking at also too, like what's actually going on, because a lot of times people feel like, well, I've tried to quit and I'm unsuccessful, and they beat themselves up over it, right? And what that tells me is that there's something else that we can address. And so, yeah, it's not just the short-term hangover that happens. And we like to call this a dose-dependent response for those of you who know anything about the science, right? But basically what it means is the more we drink, the more our body is affected by it. And so it actually does rewire our brain in some ways from a dopamine perspective. One of the ways that alcohol gives us that kind of relaxing sensation is it helps to increase GABA activity. And GABA is one of our calming neurotransmitters. So it's the neurotransmitter that helps us sit down at the end of the day, unwind and relax, right? Well,
Right.
Alcohol increases that GABA activity. And so we start to feel that kind of initial sense of relaxation. But over the long term, and this is interesting, I was just reading something about this earlier today, is the way that it affects our serotonin, our dopamine. It basically causes these kind of false excitations, if you will, but then actually blunts and has a toxic effect on the neurotransmitter, the actual synapses in the brain. So it's very complex. And I think, we think of alcohol as not being so bad because it's this legal substance, you can get it anywhere. And I like to explain to people, it's a toxin. The reason why, and I told my sister this one day and she was so mind blown, the reason why alcohol makes us feel messed up, makes us feel funny, makes us giggly, is because it's actually poisoning us. Right? That sensation, we're not able to, we're wobbling, we can't walk straight. We're actually being poisoned by the alcohol itself. And so from a health perspective, a lot of people go to, well, I know I should quit drinking because it's got a lot of sugar, or, it's a lot of excess calories. And, people are trying to switch to light beers or vodka instead of, a darker liquor. But really, it's not about that. It's about the actual alcohol itself, that's what we're drinking alcohol for. So yes, some of those things are kind of an addition on top of that, but these are things that span, years upon years upon years that we don't even really know right now. Like, I never thought about how my 13-year-old drinking habits affected my 30-year-old drinking habits. Right. But the reality is that there was a connection there. And identifying that and understanding that is really interesting and empowering, right? Because now we can start to, change the way we feel. We can start to address, going through this, I'm sure you can relate in your experiences, Bailey, like I'm like digging up all this stuff from my teenage years and like all of this stuff that I had kind of, yeah, like pushed aside and like drank it away for most of my life.
Right, right, right. A lot of times, like I like to look at what is the impetus in which we drink. And I had long made a just a I don't know, a boundary with myself that I don't drink when I'm sad. And I just don't do it. And again, no judgment on anyone else. Right? This is a completely judgment-free zone, sober or not sober, whatever. But I don't drink when I'm sad and I don't drink when I'm angry. Because,
Mhm.
what I know about brain association, I don't want to have that association that that's the solution. And it's
Mhm.
interesting how a lot of times like we'll have a stressful day and we'll say, oh God, I need a drink. Right. But if we actually like look at the language and put a parallel, what you're saying is I need a GABA response. Right. Like,
Mhm.
isn't that what we're saying? I need a GABA response, or like I need to decompress.
I'm sure you've all heard the saying, nothing changes if nothing changes. And that's true. It's really hard to make change in our life without taking the time to actually look at the way that we're showing up in the world and the thoughts that we have that really dictate the way that we show up in the world. That is why we created the 90-day Elevate Journal. You're definitely going to want to grab this, and it's available now on Amazon. The 90-day Elevate Journal is essentially designed for you to take a deep dive into what it really means to rise, transform, and lead. Grab your copy for less than $20. You can always visit www.themindrise.com/elevate or check it out in the show notes. But you need to grab your copy of the 90-day journal now and really elevate to the next level.
So I'm curious from your perspective, like why do people drink? And why, if they are sober curious, why do they struggle with, at times, like struggle with sobriety?
It's such a complex answer to that question. Everybody's experiences around alcohol are so different. And I'm writing a book right now, which is on like the tail end of being written. But one of the things, I went to Bali earlier this year and started writing the book. And I have this moment, and I write about it somewhere in the book, where I was sitting on the beach and I'm by myself. I'm at this cafe on the beach and I'm having some club soda with lime. And it was the first time I traveled without drinking. And I'm just like looking around at the little cafe. It's evening time. And there's like, the alcohol kind of setup is happening, right? You've got this group over here that they're all partying and ordering drink after drink. And then you've got a guy and his girlfriend, and they're, her with her glass of wine and him with a beer. And you look around at this like ritual of alcohol in life, right? And we all have some level of exposure to it, right? And so, like you said, some of us have that from early life. And early life could mean, if you have alcohol in the family, for me, that goes one of two ways. It usually goes, okay, you either become an alcoholic because you see that in your family life and that's normal, quote unquote. Or you see that and you say, I'm going to avoid being that way because I don't want to be that way, right? Sometimes we don't want to be that way and we still end up that way, which is kind of what happened to me. And we can't always control those things, right? But there's so many reasons behind why we drink. A lot of that is associated with habit and pattern. And like you said, a lot of times people have that 5 o'clock glass of wine at the end of the day. They get home from work, they pop open the bottle and they have a glass of wine, right? A lot of that is based on habit. There's also, and I talk a little bit about these different archetypes in the book, there are people who are more social drinkers, right? And they don't maybe drink as frequently. They don't drink every day. They maybe don't even drink every week, but every time they go to a party or to a dinner, they can't really say no, right? A lot of people are stress drinkers, and we're drinking because, yes, I need that way to unwind, to relax. And all of that over time kind of builds up to this place where, like, even if we didn't start out thinking that we wanted or like we're going to increase our drinking, we do. And that's kind of how it happens for a lot of people, that we start drinking a little bit, it becomes more and more and more. And then we look back and we go, oh, wait, how did I get here?
Right.
Like
Right.
it's something that is so ingrained in our society today. We see it on TV. We hear about it in the music we listen to, the advertisements we see everywhere. Alcohol is like positioned because it's like, there's a book about how big alcohol is like basically big tobacco, right? They're marketing this toxic product to people with the idea that it's fun. It's going to give you this bubbling social life and a hot boyfriend and, all these other things that we all want, right? Oh gosh,
Right.
if I could just go out and have a guy buy me a drink. Did my sound go out there?
Nope, I got you.
So, it's so interesting how these things occur. And I think one of the things that might be interesting to do if you're listening and you're kind of trying to navigate these things is write it down. Like, write down some of the reasons why you drink, or write down when you are triggered to drink and you find that there's maybe something that you can see a pattern with, right?
Right.
Because a lot of it is just looking back and having this new awareness on not only alcohol and its place in our life and in our world, but also how that's affecting what we want in our life, right? Because what
Good
I
point.
found in my experience was when I took a step back and I looked at all of the things that I wanted in my life, alcohol did not serve any of those things. It didn't serve my health. It certainly didn't serve my relationships. It certainly didn't serve my mental health. It didn't serve my job, my, career goals, all of these things, right? That make life good and exciting. Right. And so a lot of times when we step back and we take a little bit of that awareness, it can give us a little bit of that empowerment to say, and this is where the sober curious thing comes in, because you don't have to have an alcohol problem to decide that you want to quit drinking. And that's one of the challenges that there's been for a long time, is that only alcoholics stop drinking.
Or
right?
pregnant ladies.
Right. And that's the thing, right? You're not drinking. Everyone's like, oh my God, you're pregnant. No, I just don't want to drink. Right. Why are you forcing it on me? It's such like a forced thing.
Isn't it so funny? It's such a culture thing,
It's such a culture thing. It's such and that's what makes it really hard for people to quit. In my Instagram, my social media, I'll take polls sometimes on my stories, and recently I'd posted one about, what holds you back? What are the biggest things that hold you back? And several people said, my spouse, my partner, my spouse, social situations. And I think of that as, when I was a drinker, I found other people who drank because that was what I did. That was who I most closely associated with, right? So if we are in a relationship where both people drink and they drink together, when one person decides that they don't want to do that anymore, well, what happens to the relationship, right? There's this fear that so much of it is built on alcohol, that if one person changes, will the other person be upset? Will the other person leave them? How are they going to kind of navigate those situations? And so, it's not as easy as just saying one day, like, oh, I'm going to quit drinking, right? Most people don't have that kind of awareness. It's usually this kind of slow internal, like, knowing or whispering of your, like, this voice saying inside of you, maybe I should quit. Maybe this isn't working well for me. And that kind of continues to happen over and over again until a lot of us decide to make that change.
Right. And it's interesting, as you're talking about this, I think about the times when I've been at a party and I might be either training for a race or I've got an early morning the next morning and I don't, I'm not drinking. And, I remember there was a time in my life where someone said, oh, are you pregnant? I'm like, no, no, I've just got this race in the morning. And it would be curious because some people would just drop it because I had a reason, right? Mm-hmm. But then there would be other people that I would say, oh, I've got to get up early. I've got a flight. I've got whatever. I'm just, I'm good. And then they would almost, I don't want to go as far as say bully, but it was interesting how like they made it mean something about them sometimes. The people that had an issue with it, the people that didn't have an issue with it, they could care less what choice I was making. Right.
Right.
But, you know, it was so interesting when people bully or they give you a hard time. Did you find that experience for yourself in any way?
Yeah, unfortunately, that happens with a lot of people, and that makes it harder for people to stop, right? Because that's the social pressure that we get when, especially again, when we've kind of created this world around us of people that drink, right? And if they were drinking anything like we were, if we're heavy drinkers at the end, right? Then they're kind of feeling like, oh, wait, why did they stop? Are they kind of, should I stop? Like, what is this saying about me? Right. And it's a mirror thing, right? So we kind of have to take our own selves out of it. And a lot of times I have friends or people who will say to me, ask me about it, how it's going, and they'll immediately say back, well, I've cut back a lot too. I'm only drinking a couple days a week and da da da. And it's like, okay, like, I'm happy to hear that.
Right.
I
I'm not
didn't
here to judge
necessarily
you.
ask, right? I
Yeah.
didn't necessarily ask, but people get this kind of feeling like you're trying to push sobriety on them, right? Or say something about them. And you're right. It often comes from people who are already questioning their relationship with alcohol, already kind of thinking those things, but aren't ready to necessarily explore it yet. So I think there's this really interesting kind of dynamic. And I don't want to say jealousy in a sense of, you know, being jealous of someone's life, but I've had situations where, I had someone bully me. I was at a wedding a few months ago and they were kind of bullying me about it. Obviously I talk about this stuff very publicly. And so everyone knows that I don't drink. And I talk about it a lot. And he was kind of bullying me to, oh, I'm going to take a picture of you, next to this beer and da, 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 da. And then he would pull me over to the side after and go, no, but really, I wish I could do what you're doing. Right. And so there's this piece of us that's like,
interesting.
I think it's like, man, if I could tell you how I felt at the end of my drinking days,
Yeah, what was that like?
I was so desperate to feel any other way than I was feeling. And this is a lot of people, it takes, unfortunately, us to get to these deeper pits before we make a change. And part of what I want to do today with my messages and what I do with nutrition and sobriety is help people get there before they have to really feel that way, right? Part of the reason why Alcoholics Anonymous is the way it is, and it's about people who have hit bottom, is because oftentimes people have to have these bad experiences before they wake up and say, I can't do this anymore, right? We kind of get by for a while on this, like, nothing too bad's happening. I feel kind of crappy, but like, alcoholics are like people who live on the street and people who don't have jobs. And that's not true.
Right.
In fact, there's a lot of very high functioning people, people who have a lot of money and people who have powerful jobs. And alcohol fuels that, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to look any one which way.
Right.
There's so much power in like learning more about yourself without alcohol and how we cope with our stresses, how we cope with our emotions, how we handle life without having to kind of check out from it.
Right. So it's interesting. I was back home for the holidays and I went out to see a band with a friend of mine. And so we're just laughing, we're catching up. And she says to me, oh, so-and-so, he's California sober. And I was like, what does that mean? Like, did he move from California? And even sober curious wasn't even like a terminology that we were using probably even a year ago or 2 years ago, right? So I love that there's new terminology, but have you heard of this California sober? It cracked me up.
California sober is, they don't use any alcohol or other drugs, but they do smoke marijuana. So it's not necessarily, a lot of people will argue that that's not true sobriety, right? Because you're still using a mind-altering substance. It's kind of a controversial topic in the sobriety world, which is why I think the sober curious nature is so attractive to people, right? Because it doesn't mean that you have to say, I think what's very fearful about people opening up and wanting to become sober is if they fail and they drink or they use a mind-altering substance, that says something about them, right? That they couldn't manage this, right? So people don't want to lock themselves into the idea that I'm never having a drink again, right?
Right.
So it feels better to be like, well, I'm going to explore this sober thing a little bit, but like if I'm at a wedding and I want to have a glass of champagne, then I'm going to have a glass of champagne. There's also this notion of it of, you know, if you do go back to drinking, let's say you take 2 months off and then you drink again. Well, now you kind of have this new awareness of it, right? Well, why did I drink? Did I end up drinking too much? What kind of, you know, what did that feel like? Did I like how that felt? So you get a little bit of clarity that you don't necessarily have when you're drinking on a regular basis. So yes, there's lots of new terms coming out all the time. In fact, a recent one on TikTok that I heard about called a damp lifestyle, which means that you drink less. So you're not wet and you're not dry, you're damp.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that's what the Gen Zers are calling it.
Right. Well, and I think that you made a good point early on about Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z, and how Gen Z isn't necessarily turning toward alcohol, and they are choosing other substances. And to me, it invites in a conversation of like, do we need labels? Do we not need labels? Do we sometimes need a label or desire a label just so that we feel like, hey, I want to share my identity? And then do we feel uncomfortable with putting a label because it's almost like being I don't know, like a pescatarian, where it's like, okay, well, I eat fish, but I don't eat anchovies, but I eat cheese, but
right. And does anybody ask you questions or take a burger and like stuff it in your face?
Right. And here's the thing. Does anybody care? Like, can we just let ourselves be in a space of getting to know who we are? And whether that's wet, dry, damp, sober, curious, California sober, whatever it is. And I think getting to know yourself, but also to your point, Brooke, like getting to know the science behind it, understanding why I might have a craving. Is it a habit? Is it actually a nutritional deficiency that I'm navigating? So I also want to plug your Instagram because I have learned so much from Brooke's Instagram, because I find, and we'll put it all in the show notes, but I find that you are not judgmental at all. You're not preachy at all. It's not a matter of like, you have to do this to like be in my club. It's just like, hey, here's some information. Like, hey, did you know? And I've learned a lot about the effects of alcohol on our brain, our body, our nutrition. So what would you say are some of the most like aha or like, whoa, things that you've learned along the way when it comes to the effect of alcohol and nutrition in the body?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you for saying that, Bailey. I do on the back end get a lot of mean comments of people saying that I'm patronizing and all these things. And like you said, a lot of times it's people that are feeling triggered by it in some way, right? And so unfortunately, we send those people lots of love and we hope that, you know, one day they can be kinder to people, that, you know, it's not saying anything to them, directed at them, what have you. But the reason why I share what I do is my intent is to educate people so that they can make a better decision to, you know, live a life that they want to live, to feel the way that they want to feel, to reach the goals that they want to reach, and alcohol, kind of taking out alcohol being a way of getting there. But, you know, I'm always fascinated by, I've known for a long time about how alcohol depletes nutrients. So basically every nutrient that we need, all of our B vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin D, all of the minerals, omega-3s, alcohol is basically wiping our body out of all of the nutrients we need, which is why when we drink on a daily or very regular basis, we're likely affected by that in some way. So that can manifest as low energy, that can manifest as mood imbalances, as anxiety, that can manifest as hormone imbalances, immune system. I mean, you name it, and that could be affected.
Okay, I want to pause you for a second. I'm going to reiterate to everyone what Brooke is saying to you. So you're drinking the green juice, you're having your orange juice, you're like eating a balanced meal, you're buying organic, you're doing all the good stuff, putting all the nutrients in your body. And just FYI, and again, no judgment, you do you, but alcohol is cutting away at all that nourishment that you're trying to do for your body. That to me was one of the bigger mind blowers that I did see on your Instagram, because I was like, hold up a second. Now I understood that it would affect our brain, but to understand, and I'm sure everybody got Brooke's point, but I just want to really drive it home that you could be doing all the best things with your nutrition, and alcohol is going to slash and burn.
And it's something that trust me, I tried this. I experimented personally on this for a long time of how can I do every detox? How can I take supplements to support my liver? Bailey, if I'm not mistaken, you and I were once at a bachelorette party together where I was handing out anti-nutrient or anti-alcohol antioxidants to people.
Yes, I remember. It was like
for their livers. And the reality is that we can't erase that, right? We can't. Alcohol is so damaging to the system that we could put all the green juice in, we could put all the supplements, all the nutrients. It doesn't matter because alcohol is basically like bringing us back down, right? So that's something to keep in mind too. And as you mentioned, like it being one of the most toxic things, there are so many people who are focusing on, clean personal products, clean water, clean all of these things, and we're paying extra for them, right? But we're really like erasing the benefit of that by putting this toxic compound into our system.
Well said. Well said. And I mean, and again, no judgment. You can choose to drink the champagne and drink the green juice. I happen to sit in that camp for where I am in life right now. So there's no judgment. It's just, I think it's like when we were in school, like the more you know, right? Just here's the information. Do with it what you will. Yeah.
And one of the things that I speak to people a lot about is, people have health concerns. And from having a history working in clinical practice and my experience in creating protocols that kind of affected many, many people throughout some of the products I've created, is people will be so willing to take all the supplements, to do the diets, to try all the things, right? But if you touch their alcohol, right? They don't want to do it. And it's no judgment. I like how you're reiterating this, Bailey. But what I like to remind people is that if you have a health goal, if you want to lose weight, if you have an autoimmune disease, if you have a gut imbalance, if you have anxiety, depression, if you have low energy, I mean, you name it. If you have any of those things and you drink alcohol, cutting out alcohol would be my first suggestion to you, because that in and of itself is kind of destroying the foundation of your nutrients, your immune system, your energy levels, all of these things that are kind of baseline foundation for your health, right?
Right.
In addition to the fact that alcohol does have these impacts on the liver and how our body removes waste. It affects our gut, which is another big area that oftentimes when I talk about, people are really interested in, because a lot of people have tried healing their guts for years and not have success. Well, let's take a look at alcohol, right? Hormone imbalances, how many people struggle with PMS or infertility, right? There's some really interesting evidence on how alcohol affects the body's ability to conceive. So it's really, it's a complex thing, but again, it's almost one of the easiest, like lowest hanging fruit, if you will, to eliminate if you want to feel better, but it's not always the easiest piece of fruit to chop off the tree, right?
Oh, absolutely. It reminds me of a very odd story, but long story short, I was at a Christmas party. My aunt, who's a chiropractor, and she had a reflexologist there. She had a massage therapist there. Everyone was doing like little mini services for this Christmas party. And I remember I was 23 and I sat down to the reflexologist and she's touching my foot and she said, "Oh, you're allergic to gluten. You're allergic to wheat." And I had just like shoved all the Christmas cookies in my face. And I was just like, no, I have no rash. Like, what do you mean? And it was just like one of those moments. And, she was doing her magic and she said, just give it up for a month and see how you feel. And I just thought, well, that's the most bizarre thing. And that was like 17 years ago. So like a hot minute ago, where gluten-free wasn't sexy or popular or cool, or even like, it was kind of a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Right? And so I said, okay, a month. What's a month? I'll give it a whirl. And my arthritis cleared up like that. And I had arthritis since I was 6 years old. The crippling, can't press on the gas or the brake when driving because it was so in my joints. If it was like raining or cold, I mean, I would be in major pain. So I just share that story with everyone because for whatever your story is or whatever's going on with your body, there could be, like, and I don't want to be as dramatic as to say like the one thing, because I don't believe in like the one pill or the one diet or the magic wand. But sometimes there can be something that makes a sweeping difference in your life. And I mean, again, that was 17 years ago that I gave up gluten. That like from that month, it was such a game changer. I never had the like searing pain that I had after I gave that up. So I'm with Brooke and if you're navigating like gut issues or just stuff that's like so unexplained, might not be a bad idea. Just try it. Like you can always go back to drinking.
Now it's easier because there's such a boom in the non-alcoholic beverage industry. There's mocktails on every menu, every place that you go, majority of places. The non-alcoholic beverage space is booming. And I have some information about that on my site and some good suggestions and recommendations there. But one thing that I want to comment on about your suggestion of 30 days, and I'll transition to telling you a little bit about the book, is that in the book, that's the baseline suggestion, right? Anyone, depending on, no matter where you're at in the process, sober curious, still drinking, want to know more, the minimum suggestion that I have is to give it up for a month, right? Because we could do anything for a month. Right. There's all of these challenges like dry Januaries and sober Octobers and, people getting involved in these dry months. And what a lot of people are finding is that after 30 days, yes, they really do notice a difference in their energy. They notice a difference in their motivation, their focus, all of these things that I think we know innately that alcohol is affecting them, but we don't even realize the true impact of that because we drink frequently enough that our body never really fully recovers, right? It takes 8 to 10 days or so, they say, for alcohol to completely be eliminated from the system, from your metabolism. So it's going to take you 30 days really to start to replenish your system, to start to kind of get into new habits and go to a few events, for example, without drinking, or a dinner where you're not drinking. So it's a really good way to explore what life is like without alcohol in it. And if it's something that you might want to continue doing moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think anything is a nice start. And excuse me, like if that start is inspiration, if it's awareness, if it's just like, oh, wow, I made this commitment and I'm finding like, ooh, the sun goes down and it's like 5 o'clock and I'm thinking I want to have a drink. Oh, that's a very interesting thing about me. Whereas, okay, I'm not doing that. Well, how long is that going to last for me? Like, let me see. And just, again, Brooke, I think it's about getting into a deeper relationship with yourself when you're just observing yourself. You can always go back to drinking. You can change your habits. You can be California sober if you want. You do you, right? That's the point. But here's the information. I'd love to have you back on when we've got the book released so we can jam and talk about the book too.
Yeah. Next fall. So fall of 2023, just wrapping up the final kind of pieces of it. And one thing that I do have to say, Bailey, is Bailey was my first life coach ever. Many, many years back. I couldn't even tell you the year that it was, maybe 2015 or 2016. And I remember us having a conversation. I actually remember we were on a call and I was sitting on the beach. And I remember saying to you that I wanted to write a book. And you asked me why and where that came from. And I remember saying something like, I come from a family where we read books. We didn't write books, and I want to write a book. And, it was a goal that I had carried with me for so long. I mean, if you look at every one of my journals that I've started at every new year, it was, someday I'm going to write a book. I had no idea what I was going to write a book about. No freaking clue. I was just like, one day I'll figure it out. Well, I got sober, and probably 3 months into it, I had this light bulb moment where I was like, no one's talking about this. I should write a book on it.
Right.
And I picked up my laptop at 9:30 at night. I was Googling how to write a query letter. I cold reached out to 2 agents. I signed an agent, pitched a book deal to 25 publishers, had 4 bids, and went with 1. And so it was something that would not have happened without my sobriety. And, what I can say, if you're listening and this is kind of like tugging at you a little bit in your gut and you're kind of feeling like, maybe I'm curious, and this is, you don't have to make the change forever. One of the really interesting and key things that I do bring up from the Alcoholics Anonymous terminology is one day at a time, right? You don't have to decide that you're not going to drink ever again, right? In fact, people who want to have lifetime sobriety still take it a day at a time, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I remember when I first got sober, I was like, what about at my wedding? I didn't even have a boyfriend, right? Like, why am I thinking that far ahead? Right.
I love it.
Reality is that over the next couple months, years, that all went away, right? All that fear went away. So if you can just start taking it in small bits and saying, I just want to see how I feel without this. I want to see how I do after a month. And finding resources can be really helpful too. Bailey will leave my information and my site in the show notes, but I launched an online course and an online network that is all based around sobriety through a nutrition lens, or Sober Curious, because it is just something that we tend to need support on, and find a community of like-minded people. And that information is really empowering to find that kind of understanding behind it, instead of just saying, I am this way and I don't know why. There's so much empowerment, and I know that that's what you're all about, Bailey. So
absolutely.
the last thing I'll say that you taught me is that I'm in the driver's seat of my own life. And so are you, as you're listening. And you have the ability to pull off at the next exit instead of heading to the bar or heading to have a drink. And so I think little baby moments, little bits of time, just doing something that serves your greater purpose. And that's how we get there.
I love it. I love it. And you're right, Brooke, one day at a time. Like, no one's perfect. No one has it all figured out. No one can predict all the way down the road what things are going to look like. And you're right. Like, that's where we get to be in the driver's seat of our life and decide what we want our life to look like as we move forward. Yay. I love it. Yeah, thank you so much for being on. And then I'm absolutely with you. We'll throw all the information in the show notes, but courses are great. Courses are great because it is the more you know, right? You don't know what you don't know. And definitely, if at the very least, follow Brooke on social media so that you can just get plugged into this information that, I like to think I'm well educated, but it's so refreshing to have an expert just right on your Instagram or your TikTok that, has a different perspective. And it's great for you to be able to plug into that and get the information that you might want.
Thank you so much, Bailey.